Dr. Pandit. Dr. Pandit is an associate professor of medicine in the pulmonary critical care and sleep medicine section at Baylor College of Medicine. She is board certified in internal medicine and pulmonary medicine, specializing in the care of patients in the intensive care unit. She serves as director of the Michael E. DeBakey Veteran Affairs Pulmonary Hypertension Program and has led the Baylor VA site on 2 multinational pharmaceutical clinical trials on COVID-19. She also co-chairs the Baylor College of Medicine Department of Medicine's IDEA Speaker Series, inviting experts to Houston to address challenges in inclusivity, diversity, and equity. She is dedicated to veteran care and research in underserved populations. Dr. Pandit enjoys spending time with her family while remaining culturally active in Houston's vibrant South Asian American community. Dr. Pandit, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning. Can you all see my slides?
Yes, everything looks great.
Wonderful. I want to thank the CBMHR Engagement Corps for inviting me to speak on such an amazing topic, and I've thoroughly enjoyed all the speakers. And I feel a bit outmaneuvered by this amazing panel, and I'm just going to get right into it. I'm going to be talking today about specifically COVID-19 treatment trials and how it relates to minority health. As if we aren't sick of COVID-19 already. But I'm here to present some good news, certainly some good news when it comes to science, and also, where we're going and what we really need to continue improving on with regards to minority health and engagement in research. So the US population, when it comes to COVID-19, here is our breakdown of our general population as of recent census data. 61.5% white, 12.6% Black, 18% Hispanic, and the rest are Asian American and other. But then when we look at COVID-19 mortality, you see some interesting findings. There's clearly an increased representation in specifically Black and Hispanic population when it comes to those who are dying from COVID-19 compared to the placement within the US population census. So we call that a disproportionate mortality and case fatality rate. And what that basically means and translates to is that Hispanic and Black persons are disproportionately represented among those who have died from COVID-19. So Black and Hispanics constitute 44% of COVID-19 deaths, despite representing only 31% of the US population. And this was identified early on in the pandemic as a major problem. And here, just to break it down more, you see here, let me focus on specific statistics for you. You see here within certain minority populations, even though the case rate is this much, the hospitalization rate and the death rate referenced to our white American brothers and sisters is much higher. And again, problematic and identified early on in the pandemic. And so knowing all this, did we adjust our treatment and management of COVID-19? Well, let's see, and that's what I'm going to present to you. The disease is divided into mild, moderate, and the more severe forms of infection. My colleagues and I in the intensive care unit usually take care of moderate to severe disease. Thankfully, most COVID-19 remains mild and not requiring hospitalizations. But as I showed you in the previous slides, African-American populations and Hispanic populations in this country tend to have a disproportionate amount of moderate to severe disease and ultimately fatality. And so when we look at the science of the disease, we look at the stage 1, early infection, and that's when the virus is kind of taking hold in our lungs, epithelial cells. And as a pulmonary intensive care doctor, we have a particular interest in the way these virions attach to the lung cells. And this is when, you first feel the mild constitutional symptoms of fever, that dry cough. There won't be too many laboratory findings. Sometimes the x-ray may be even clear severe. But this is the initial phase. And many of the people who are infected with mild symptoms often do not require hospitalization. At this point, we do have particular antibodies that have been approved, and these are for outpatient therapy. It's one-time infusion. Some of you may be familiar with this. You can usually obtain this through most ERs, particularly in the medical center. Well, then what about moderate disease? Well, this is where you have more increased shortness of breath. You probably need some oxygen. Usually you require hospitalization at this point to be monitored. You may or may not have some signs of kidney and liver disease. And these are the drugs that have been shown to be developed as beneficial in moderate disease. And I'll just quickly go through them. Remdesivir, dexamethasone, which is basically a steroid, oxygen therapy. And then I'll just highlight at the bottom a drug called Tocilizumab, which we'll get back to in a little bit. And that's a mouthful, type of antibody. And then we get to the severe disease. The severe disease biologically is thought to be due to something called the host inflammatory response. And this is basically when our own body mounts a very hyperinflammatory excess immune response to the initial viral infection. And oftentimes, in this case, our own body's response causes more damage to our organs than the initial viral infection. And so what do we do here? Pretty similar, but less research showing benefit. Again, steroids have been shown to help reduce morbidity and mortality in the stage 3 hyperimmune phase, as well as certainly oxygen, sometimes mechanical ventilation. And then again, tocilizumab has been shown to be somewhat beneficial in that group as they're progressing to severe disease. So I'm just showing you the science of this hyperinflammatory response. Basically, what we were looking at with tocilizumab was specifically this molecule called IL-6. And I should say that a lot of this research that we've done to identify these drugs basically condensed the usual 20 years of research from preclinical animal models that Dr. Olelia's group has done so painstakingly, and what Dr. Fasipe's group showed us can take 20 years sometimes. So the good news with COVID is we have really extrapolated research from a 20-year process to pretty much a 2-year process now, which is phenomenal and gives us a lot of confidence in the science. And so the science, basically, I cannot take credit for this, was a molecule called IL-6 that many colleagues before me have identified is involved in this hyperimmune response. And so another treatment, which everybody is talking about, and probably the biggest positive response, is regarding the COVID vaccine. And yes, the vaccine is a treatment. Here's the interesting thing, though. In order for the COVID vaccine to be efficacious and really make a dent in this pandemic, we need 60 to 72% of our population vaccinated. We're not quite there yet, as you may hear, but we're definitely getting there. And our hope by the federal government and by local institutions is to do that. And much of the discussion that we all are having today is regarding involving minority populations in vaccination and public health measures. And so just to show you, this was a little bit a while ago, but this was back in October, right before the vaccines came out and the first 2 were approved by the FDA. How likely are you to get a COVID vaccine as it becomes available was asked to the entire US population and then divided between white Americans and Black Americans. And you see here, back in October, 58% on average likely to take the vaccine, which had actually dropped. That has slightly increased now, but we're still not near the 68 to 70% needing to achieve herd immunity, which is again why public engagement is so important when it comes to COVID-19 treatments and vaccination. And as I said, Black Americans were less likely to say they would get vaccinated back in October. And so knowing that this disease has some disparities, how do we address this when it comes to clinical research and trial structure? And, the New England Journal of Medicine, premier medical journal, addressed this head on. They didn't pussyfoot around it. They said, as we strive to overcome social and structural causes of healthcare disparities, we must recognize the underrepresentation of minority groups in the COVID-19 clinical trials. And because everything about COVID-19 was extrapolated and really put on the fast track, it was a good thing for medical science to really acknowledge this head on, particularly addressing the history, as Dr. Sotoke had said, of the lack of minority involvement in clinical trials. And so the racial disparity within COVID clinical trials, was still present. Certainly the ACT-1 trial, which is the main trial that established the role of remdesivir, that antiviral, included sites where Black, Latinx, and Native Americans are overrepresented. But importantly, these groups were substantially underrepresented in the study samples. And here you see a graphic of that. White population was the predominant population in these trials across the states that were represented, despite the fact that minority groups were represented in the overall population there. So remdesivir specifically, data supporting the drug's efficacy and safety in minority groups was thus thought to be limited. And that's because they were not included as highly as thought in the original clinical trials. Specifically, Black Americans only accounted for 20% in the ACT-1 trial, which is the randomized controlled trial that established the efficacy of remdesivir. And then importantly, they only accounted for 11% of the 397 patients randomly assigned to remdesivir in another pharmaceutical study. And same with Latinx and Native American patients. And so again, the modest benefits seen in clinical improvement with remdesivir may not be generalizable to minority populations given the differences in disease severity and outcomes. And so this is a major problem with the COVID clinical trials when it comes to remdesivir, one of the primary treatments in COVID-19. And so let's get back to this slide. What about tocilizumab? Recently added to the NIH armamentarium for approval for COVID-19, and we're just starting to use this now in the hospital more frequently. And so I was very proud to actually be part of this trial. The important thing about tocilizumab, which is an antibody against IL-6, one of those hyperimmune markers, is that it was mostly done in underserved populations, mostly men though, not women, unfortunately. And my co-I, Dr. Troutner, Barbara Troutner here, and myself, and this is us with our gear on in clinic, washing our hands very vigorously. We were very fortunate to be part of this trial that was a multi-site trial across the country that looked at the efficacy of tocilizumab in hospitalized patients. And this was a phase 3 trial, as has been described by the previous speakers. So again, really extrapolated rate of science. And what our colleagues and us were able to show was in this demographics of a total 317 patients, we tried to really recruit patients from previously underrepresented groups, specifically in Hispanic or Latino American groups. 143 patients were in the tocilizumab group, whereas 63 patients were in the placebo group. Black Americans, 14% in the treatment group and 16% in the placebo group, and 13% of American Indian or Alaska Native in the treatment group and 11% in the placebo group. And this was higher than previous COVID treatment trials, and it really kept the focus on underserved minority populations. And what we were able to show in this specific minority population that was more than 80% minority was that the likelihood of progression to mechanical ventilation or death at 1 month was significantly lower among patients who received tocilizumab compared to standard.
Dr. Pandit, sorry to cut you off. You have 2 minutes remaining.
Thank you. So that's why this particular study raised some interest among the scientific community. I just want to show you the racial breakdown within the COVID-19 vaccine trials. Pfizer and Moderna are the 2 mRNA trials that have been approved. And I just wanted to show you this data and focus in on the enrollment, 10% in the Pfizer trial, 10% in the Moderna trial. And again, you know, although Black Americans represent 12% of the population, 10% represented in these trials. Not quite up to snuff, but getting better compared to historical values. And so importantly, the take-home points I take from this is that people of color are still underrepresented in the clinical trials for the 2 initial COVID-19 vaccine, but more diverse than previous historic trials. And the safety and efficacy were similar for people of color. And that's very important to increase confidence and willingness to get the vaccine. And so let's just jump why we need to improve minority health and research. So we need to address the history, as Dr. Sudake very, very emotionally charged showed us in that very moving video. Address the history and perceptions of conjured feels of fear and exploitation, and allow our patients to gain information about cancer care and clinical trials, as our previous speakers have very elegantly shown us. Address the lack of representation in science and industry. Who are running these trials? And we have fantastic scientists who have spoken to us today. Where are the Black women in STEM leadership? And when we train diverse women to become leaders, the whole system benefits. Women were afforded 20% of the doctorates in STEM, Black women, but only 5% of the top supervising managerial jobs. That's a problem. And so these are the things that can also affect vaccine hesitancy. Where is the source of information coming from? Are public health officials trusted more than politicians? On average, older people and Black people and women are less willing to be vaccinated. And so we need to address why that is. And perhaps it is the public health messaging. We have to improve the scientific validity of our epidemiologic design. And what that means is not all diseases represent and manifest the same amongst minority populations compared to our white population. And so we need to address this head on. These gaps can leave us a problem in terms of informing clinical and public health. And so we need to address the differences between minority group health when it comes to health and access to care, as well as living and working conditions. What kind of access and conditions do our minority underserved populations have compared to others? And the CDC has kind of begun to address this head on. And so I want to focus on the last part, particularly adapt public health recommendations to community circumstances. And I want to just highlight one of my colleagues who is starting to do this. Dr. Marcela Nunez-Smith has actually recently been named a member of the COVID-19 task force and appointed by the president to chair the Health Equity Task Force. So she addresses this head on. How do you advocate for healthcare equity and engage in the communities? And I know that our panel are experts in this today, people in the right trials that affect their everyday lives. Thank you very much.